Hi, Lewis from a Very Suspect podcast here. And before we start with this new episode, we just wanted to say thank you to all the people that have been downloading and listening to our rants and conversations, and we hope that you've been enjoying it, because we really enjoy doing it. And if you do, and if you have, then please let other people know about it, and let's spread the word, and hopefully we can get more people into our crazy little show. And we're going to be starting a Patreon, like so many other people do. And whatever you can donate would be greatly appreciated. It'll just go into the kitty and pay for different elements that cost us in making this show. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks a lot for your support. And hopefully you've liked the topic so far. Enjoy.
Two pregnant women at the same time?
I don't know what it is.
I want to see it. Looks pretty good.
Disgusting. He's a fat pig.
Oh, come on, I like that kind of stuff.
It's a prostitute.
Why? It's just a movie. Come on. It's only a movie.
For tuning in to a Very Suspect podcast. Here's Lewis and Glen.
Hello again to another episode of a Very Suspect podcast. And here again is Glen.
Hello.
And me, Lewis. Hello. And today's episode is about, I guess, a topic that a lot of people don't know about, which was a surprise to me because it was pretty important to me and to you and to, like, Suspect in general and the people that were coming in. And it's the cinema of transgression. Mm-hmm. And you may ask yourself, some of you, what is the cinema of transgression? But before we talk about that, well, should we just bring it up like in basics and then kind of go back and talk about
Explain it in layman's terms what it's about, what it meant, the cinema of transgression? Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to start?
You can start.
I mean, should I start with the pre-cinema transgression, which maybe led to the cinema transgression? Put a little bit of context to it?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, I guess, go back to the stuff that might have inspired the cinema transgression, I guess...
Wait, first we should just talk about what it is, like, in
what
very broad,
is?
general terms.
Okay,
yeah.
Sure.
So that would be...
I mean, yeah, I think the hardest part is really trying to describe what the cinema transgression, specifically the cinema transgression cinema, which represents a certain time period in New York primarily. Yeah. I mean, that's where it was sort of coined to talk about the films that were coming out from the late 70s through to the mid 80s primarily, but it did stretch on beyond that even to a certain degree. Although I'd say that was the real period of activity was probably the mid 80s. You know, that's when it really sort of peaked with the films of Richard Kern and Nick Zedd. But there was stuff before that and there was stuff after that, including stuff by those people. But yeah, I guess it's something that you associate with New York City, Lower East Side, mid-'80s, subversive cinema, sex and violence, obsessed, drenched in that kind of obnoxiousness.
Yeah, micro-budgeted.
No budgeted.
Budgeted, yeah.
But still very willing to try gore effects and things of that nature, even with no money, which was similar to what a lot of horror and exploitation filmmakers were doing, too. Didn't have much of a budget, but they still had a little bit of money for blood, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it was almost like a cinema of personality and anger and, subversion in any and all kind of ways.
And very tied into the music scene that was happening in New York at that time as well. I mean, a lot of these films were populated by people who were in these bands. That was another part of it too, is that it's sort of tied in with the Lower East Side music scene and then the film scene of that style of film, obviously. Yeah.
So that's the basic overview. Now, where did this all come from stylistically and thematically and everything?
Yeah, and various people have different opinions on that, of course. Various writers will have different opinions on that. But, I mean, if you were to point to some obvious things, people bring up John Waters for the shock value. The Kuchar brothers for some of the same aspects, but also just sometimes the bizarre nature of some of the storylines. Going back further, you got people like Jack Smith in movies like Flaming Creatures, which again is a representative of the New York underground of an earlier time period, the 60s. But
and Kenneth Anger as well.
Kenneth Anger obviously definitely had some of that. I think anybody who made short films that, especially if they utilized a lot of music, as well, and
not necessarily that they had the rights to.
No, not that they had the rights to it, but just utilize music and some sort of pop culture elements to it as well. Which it was definitely the case with Kenneth Anger. I don't think that was as important to the cinema transgression per se, that there was pop culture angles. They didn't really care about that. They were more interested in almost like chaos and anarchy. They were interested in subversion. And if that was mainly broadcast through in terms of sex and violence, that's the way they chose to do it, obviously.
Yeah. And also, there's a strong element of self-promotion, too. Because obviously, there were no venues for these things. They had to be created by the filmmakers themselves, right?
Yeah.
So that was an important element. Even John Waters, I think, would have to, rent out a theater and really try to promote them to promote himself, you know. And that's what these guys did too. Is that
and they often screened their movies in clubs that were playing these kinds of bands that were the soundtracks to their movies. It just made sense that those two worlds were going to mix, because it was basically one world. The people in the movies were doing the music. It was a lot of the same kind of thing. Some of these filmmakers were also involved in music. Richard Kern was in bands. All these people were doing music as well as the film, and so it was just a natural, I guess, end result that you would end up screening these movies in the same places that the bands were playing. It was the same audience that was going to appreciate them, essentially. And Richard Kern and Nick Zedd were the bigger names to come out of the New York scene of cinema transgression, but there was people before them that were probably the influences on them to make these films as well. And it was an interesting time period, definitely. But I don't know if we want to focus on any one particular thing.
I don't know. You before we started recording, you even mentioned the Vienna Actionists.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an influence too. But was it an influence at the time? Was it were they aware that was an influence, or is that something that some of these people found out about after the fact? Even you really don't know.
You don't know.
What came first, the chicken or the egg? There. I don't know. The Viennese Actionists. I look at that stuff, the Autumn Mule films, and think, well, yeah. You can kind of see if they were aware of that, how it would potentially influence what they were doing. The difference is the Actionists were actually doing these things, and a lot of what Kern's people were doing were faking these things.
Yeah. It was the special effects.
Exactly.
And it was,
The only thing they couldn't fake is whatever kind of sexual conduct was happening in the movies. If Lydia Lynch was blowing a guy, Lydia Lynch was blowing a guy. But when people were slitting their own throats, they weren't slitting their own throats.
No.
But the Viennese Actionists, they were pretty much doing what you saw them doing. If they were cutting themselves, they were cutting themselves. If they were shitting on each other, they were shitting on each other.
If they were climbing into animals' carcases, they were climbing into animals' carcasses.
They were doing really what you saw them do. But obviously with the cinema transgression, it was a lot of play acting as well. When they could play act it. Obviously they couldn't play act certain things like the sex. And that obviously probably hit its peak for the New York underground with Richard Kern's Fingered, which, because basically I think when he made his previous film, Right Side of My Brain, it was labeled as pornography by a lot of the New York critics, whether it was the Village Voice or people like that. And
the intelligentsia.
Exactly. And so they thought, wow, if they think that's pornography, then the next one we make should really be pornography.
Yeah.
So then they came up with that, which John Waters says is one of the classic date movies of all time, Fingered. So, and yeah, I have to agree with them, I guess. At one point, that would probably be the kind of film I would show on a date, which is why I wouldn't have had a second date.
Well, much of the attitude stemmed from New York at the time, as you said. Mm-hmm. I mean, apparently at that time, rents were dirt cheap because nobody wanted to live there.
Yeah,
it was just, filled with junkies and rats and, like it was just not a good place to live. And that's why, and places were essentially empty. I mean, a lot of these people even admitted that they squatted and, didn't pay any rent at all.
Yeah.
And so the whole atmosphere was one of almost, despair.
Sure.
And they had to essentially rely on each other. So it was a commentary on various things.
Sure,
right?
Sure, yeah. And that kind of background was just perfect for the look of their films.
Yeah.
Junkies on street corners, all sorts of, like you said, rats, just the whole sort of dire situations that a lot of these people were living in. That was perfect for, the cinema transgression, definitely. Yeah, Kern, obviously went on to do quite well for himself with photography, more recent
he branched
years.
out.
But, I mean...
And other people sort of in the scene, maybe they weren't specifically cinema transgression folks, kind of progressed, like Jim Jarmusch was loosely affiliated with it because he was making, his films around the same area. And, again, it was micro-budgeted. It was black and white because a lot of these films were shot on like Super 8 and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And even John Lurie, who is obviously in Jarmusch's films, he also participated in things, and Steve Buscemi as well. So.
Yeah. Well, there's a documentary that covers this in real detail called Blank City.
Anything you wanted to do or people you might meet, it all was possible.
Prior to that, there really wasn't a voice for independent film.
Destroy everything before 1976. It's over. It's incinerated. We kind of came out of the destruction.
It was part of that whole thing of getting the hell out of the art world and finding a kind of cinema closer to reality.
Just bought some film from the drugstore, put it in the camera, and started rolling.
They would literally call up to my window, and we'd go down the block and shoot a scene.
Felt like we owned the city, and we could shoot without permits, without restriction.
It was right at the peak of the debauchery of New York.
Right, and Blank City covers all those filmmakers like that. I mean, whether it was people like Susan Seidelman, who did Smithereens and then went on to do Desperately Seeking Susan. Yeah. I mean, you would not say she was in that scene because she wasn't, but she was coming from the same place in the late 70s, early 80s where these people were making these movies for very little money. And their first features were obviously very small budgeted, and then eventually they got more money to make these films, and they got away from that, and they actually got picked up by real studios in the cases of people like Susan Seidelman. But there was others too. I mean, there's people like Alice Wittenstein and people like that. Actually, strangely enough, if you really think about it, there was a lot of female directors in New York at that time period.
That's true.
There was quite a few. I mean, the list is pretty huge, actually. And it was Beth B, of course, who almost in some ways, again, was before the cinema transgression peak of the 80s. She was done with it by that point. Because her early films were done with her husband at the time. So it was Beth and Scott B. And then everything just fell apart with them. And she went on and did her own films. But once she went on to do her own films, she was doing films with more money. So she was actually doing more lavish films. Same thing happened to Amos Poe. Started off doing small budgeted kind of things, and then went on to eventually do studio films. But I mean, you have to start somewhere. And in the case of Beth B, her early films definitely seem like really like an early spot of the real cinema transgression aesthetic. And she brought in people like Lydia Lunch in the early days, right, before Richard Kern worked with her, and had some of the same kind of darker themes too. And you can definitely see how. I think people like Nick Zedd didn't like Beth B. Yeah, he said a lot of negative things about her over the years, but at the same time, you can see what she was doing before what they were doing, especially in the case of Kern more than Zedd even, because Zedd did features earlier. I think his earliest one, They Eat Scum, was 79 or 80 even. I mean, it was
that early?
It was pretty early on, that first one, yeah. Because it was sort of like a commentary about punk rock, and it was even some parts were even filmed at CBGB's, I think, too. Or maybe it was Max's. But anyways, Yeah, it was pretty early on, and that was a feature, and it was a no-budget film, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had it at the store on VHS, and I guess that copy probably came from him anyways, right? Or did it come from See Here?
Well, that's what I was going to talk about, is that, I think in some ways Nick Zedd and Richard Kern are best known because they were the best self-promoters, too.
Yes, yeah.
Is that they got their stuff out there. And the way that we ordered them was through Film Threat. Because Film Threat featured them, and
Film Threat really
made it
pushed
really
the
easy.
Cinema Transgression.
Yeah,
as
it made
a whole.
it easy to find it.
Yeah.
And so we ordered initially from them, and then we ordered from Zedd directly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was all like mail order kind of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think with Film Threat too, it's kind of funny because they really promoted the Cinema Transgression as a whole, but there seemed to also be this real love-hate relationship with the people. It's like Chris Gore hated Nick Zedd, and Nick Zedd hated Chris Gore, and there were probably no great love for Richard Kern either. All these people seem to have issues with each other. I guess they are all competing for the same small little marketplace.
I guess so.
And so then there was all a lot of towards each other.
But it could be a case of kind of like, that hate kind of fuels things too, right?
Sure.
Makes it more interesting.
And it also might just have been somewhat of a put on too, for the sake of just trying to create some sort of like idea that these people are all out for themselves and against each other. Exactly. Who knows? Because Lydia Lunch would give interviews too, and she'd always be like, Chris Gore is a loser, and Chris Gore is this, that, and the other. But of course, he would continuously interview her for the magazine, and she would give interviews, so you gotta wonder, really, was this all just, again, a ruse? Was it all just basically some bullshit thing that they created? Well, we're gonna be bickering back and forth at each other all the time, like we hate each other's guts, but really, this is just business.
Yeah.
Who knows, really? Who knows? I don't really know if over the years that's really ever been discussed, or whether it was just a big put on at the time, but, they probably all had really healthy egos, so, it is easy to believe, too, that they were probably like, yeah, I'm the most important member of this scene. They probably each felt that. Probably Chris Gore felt, if it wasn't for me and my magazine, nobody would know your stupid little movies. So, they all could have probably had a certain amount of ego that caused them to have that attitude towards each other. And because they were the sort of the big movers and the shakers of that scene. Obviously, Lydia Lunch was writing the screenplays, essentially, for the films that Richard Kern would direct her in. That was something that Kern said he wanted to let her do specifically. So that way, whatever scenario she was going to put herself in was her call.
It's insulated him from being
exactly. I'm not the misogynist. I'm not the guy who puts her in rape scenes. She does that to herself. That kind of thing. So that was probably a smart move on his part. Whereas with Zedd, he wanted to control everything.
He would
write and stuff. Yeah, exactly.
But he also kind of he really explored a lot of like sexual topics too. Sure. But specifically, he was the one that kind of cross-dressed the most. Like he would present himself as male and female.
Yeah,
sometimes in the same movie.
There was that one short in Manhattan Love Suicide called "Thrust in Me."
That's right.
Where he basically gives himself a blowjob, right? Unconscious in a bathtub.
Yeah, right.
I was like, if I recall. And then there's a ridiculous cum shot.
Yeah.
Which just goes on for a minute or something. So, and there was a couple other films too where he was also in drag, like you said. But I guess he was into that. That was one of his kinks, I guess, then too.
I guess
he thought, hey, this is something I could do on camera, and but Zedd also came up with one of the more amusing films of that time period too, which was Police State. Because Police State even had Rocket's Red Glare as one of the cops in it.
Is that the only one that Red Glare was in? I seem to remember that he was in a couple of them, but maybe that was it.
Rockets was in a lot of, obviously, New York low-budget films. Yeah. But as far as the Cinema Transgression, I don't think he was in really much else. I don't think he was ever in a Kern film.
No.
I think it was only that one Zedd movie, really.
I heard that when he came up with the name Rocket's Red Glare, he was debating whether to call himself that or Jose Can You See.
No.
Have you heard that?
Okay, no, I didn't know.
Either one would have been great.
But in the early films of Beth B., she had people who went on to more success as an actor, like James Russo.
Yeah.
Would be in a movie, a Beth B. movie with Lydia Lunch. And then, of course, James Russo went on to do a lot of stuff. Like, I guess he made the progression from Beth B. to Abel Ferrara, and then on to, like, mainstream directors. So, he was one of the exceptions in that case. I guess in the same way that Steve Buscemi started off with movies like Parting Glances, low-budget New York indies, and then went on to the kind of success he had, too.
Yeah.
I mean, some people were very lucky in that scene like that, but not a lot, really. A lot of them kind of stayed more, like, in lesser-known films and didn't really get many big breaks later on, you know. And, you know, Lydia obviously didn't care. Lydia wasn't looking for Hollywood to come calling. I don't think she probably thought, well, when the people in Hollywood see me in Fingered, they're going to start offering me the lead roles in movies. I don't think she thought that was part of it, and I don't think she would have gave a damn anyways, because she had her own thing, right? You know, her performance, her spoken word, everything like that. So I don't think she really cared. She probably wasn't expecting that kind of outcome from movies like Fingered.
Yeah.
You know, at the best case scenario, she could have got offers from the world of porn.
Right.
You know, do you want to come in and do some movies? But frankly, she was a little too late on that. Had she been doing films like Fingered in the mid to late 70s, she would have had much more potential work in the world of porn, because obviously when the world of porn was shooting things on film at that point with these more exploitation-like themes, she could have fit into those movies easily. There's so many movies made in the mid to late 70s in the world of porn, especially in New York at that time, that were dark-themed, sort of almost like exploitation films with hardcore. She could have fit in those. That's where they could have brought her in easily. Because there are psychodramas as well, a lot of these porno features.
Yeah.
And cinema transgression, I think that's a key word for it, really, psychodrama. A lot of times what they were creating were these psychodramas.
Right.
So, yeah, had Lydia started earlier, she could have did porn. But unfortunately, I guess for her and the viewer, is that in the late 70s, she was only 17, 18 years old, so I mean, that wouldn't have worked in the world of porn for her at that point in time.
No, I guess not. It's interesting that you brought up Abel Ferrara, because I would almost say anybody that doesn't know the world of cinema transgression, who like Ferrara's earlier films, should probably check it out, because you know,
well, Driller Killer really is like more of a budgeted version of a cinema transgression movie.
It is,
really.
That's why, you know, and just the feel of it. I mean, the whole New York as a character itself, too, you know.
People living in shitty apartments with noisy bands making noise beside you all the time in a loft. And just that sort of like anger at the city you're living in, where this guy has to lash out at people in the street he doesn't even know. You know, I mean, that's the cinema transgression has a lot of that kind of feel in it too. I mean, that's what Fingered is. I mean, there's scenes in Fingered where they're just out in the street and they just kill a guy because he just gets in their face and says something they don't like. I mean, it's that kind of thing. And that's kind of what Driller Killer is, really. Right? It's just a guy lashing out because he's got all this anger in him. You know, so.
Ferrara isn't really a part of this movement, but, you know, certainly could have been.
And again, a guy who started with porn.
Yeah, that's true.
He was doing porn features at that time in New York City.
What was that one called? 9 Lives of a Wet Pussy?
Yeah. And and there's definitely elements in that movie even too that aren't really out of place for cinema transgression too. So you know, I mean, he's not from that scene, but he almost shares the same sort of mentality. I think probably if you were to look inside Abel Ferrara's head and Richard Kern's head, you'd maybe see some similarities. In like sort of like being just like these shit disturbers who just want to create things that you know, might get people's goat. You know, I mean, look at when Abel Ferrara made Miss 45, he decides that I'm going to be one of the rapists in the movie. I'm going to have a cameo in this movie as one of the rapists too. You know, and so I think there's something in Abel that's a little tweaked as well, probably.
That's true.
You know, and that.
But I mean, the same can be said for Argento, who's always the hands, right? The killer's hands is pretty much always Argento, right?
I think that's been the case in a lot of the films, at least.
Which is especially twisted when Asia Argento is is the protagonist. But.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's definitely the case, but the cinema transgression thing, even with the music aspect of it, I mean, whether it was music of Sonic Youth or the Swans or Pussy Galore, I mean, a lot of what they termed in New York at the time in a very creative way, pig fuck bands, in quotes.
I never heard that before.
Yeah, there was a term in New York where people referred to bands that came out of that scene as pig fuck bands, you know, or pig fucker bands, but pig fuck bands, I think, is the term.
In reference to what?
To the style of music they played. People looked at bands like Pussy Galore and other bands that came out of that scene as pig fuck bands. I mean, I don't know. It was just some music journalists that came up with this. Writers. I don't know if it came out of like magazines like Forced Exposure or other things that are more New York based, but those bands were kind of labeled that pig fuck bands, at that time.
I never heard that
before. And it was
before.
in that same era that the Cinema Transgression was happening, and bands like the Swans and Scraping Fetus and things like that. They were the kind of things that they used in the soundtracks of a lot of these movies too, because it was industrial noise kind of music and everything too, so that was perfect for it. Or you just wanted guitar noise, and then you'd have Sonic Youth, a song in a movie or whatever. I mean, obviously Richard Kern directed the music video for Sonic Youth's Death Valley 69, which of course is a collaboration between Sonic Youth and Lydia Lunch. And and he did the video for that, and that video is inspired by the Manson murders. Yeah. And that kind of imagery and everything too. And I mean, that's the kind of thing you expect from that scene. I think there's a lot of people now who don't have the experience of these films from the past because of their age, that would look at these films now and think they're highly inappropriate. Right. I mean, because at that time they were trying to offend then, and the whole idea was that, well, we're going to just take a shot at political correctness by including these kinds of images. And, people would accept that to a certain degree back then. I mean, people were still annoyed at those films even back then. But I think now, it would be way worse. I think these films would be looked at in a more that's inappropriate kind of way than they were even then. Where people back then, especially within certain types of scenes, just kind of looked at it as like, it's the right kind of appropriate imagery for this kind of music, and vice versa. The two things complemented each other. But now I think a different mindset, people just look at these things and say, that's just wrong on so many levels. Sexism, racism. I mean, there's every ism you could name is usually in a Cinema Transgression movie. And a lot of that stuff would just be looked at as like highly inappropriate, which makes it all the more fun. It's the forbidden fruit angle, I guess. That was in a large way the purpose of it, right? Exactly. To push things. Kern was asked many times if that's what he was trying to do, or you just kind of instigate people more and more with the films you do when you make them more extreme. And he's like, of course, that's really the purpose here, just to see how many people you can upset. It's like, which is why these guys put themselves in their movies too, and often some of the more nasty kind of performances too. Like in Kern's case, in movies like The Evil Cameraman and everything, he's the guy tying up the women, stringing them upside down, beating them, jerking off on them or whatever. He's the guy doing that. So I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's sort of like, I can get someone else to do it, but I can do it myself. Which basically shows that you have a little more, I don't know what the right word I'm looking for is, but I don't know. You're willing to throw yourself into the fire, not just be the guy filming someone else throwing themselves in the fire. You're the guy throwing yourself into the fire too, right? Saying, "Hey, I can get somebody to come in here and jerk off on this girl, but I can do it myself." Well, and the subtext is stronger too. Sure. If the filmmaker is doing it, then the filmmaker is supposed to be the observer's proxy. Sure. So it's basically like the observer is participating. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. It kind of like works. I know he probably did it for various reasons. That might not have been one, but I mean, the end result is that too, right? Well, he's talked a lot about this. How when he was making movies like The Evil Cameraman, I don't know if he was still using at that point, but he used heroin for a amount of time, and he said that there was a point in his life, and I'm not sure if it was while he was using or just after he stopped using, where he wanted really aggressive sort of sex scenes. He really wanted women to be, trussed up and not really know what was going to happen, because he wouldn't really give them all the details before they would film. He would just say, here's the scenario, and I'm going to do things to you. And so he said in some of the films you can see the people really being kind of apprehensive because they don't know where he's going to take it. But so he did that in films like The Evil Cameraman, which again, even the title of that movie is basically like a joke on himself. Even there, he's the evil cameraman, come up with these crazy things I'm going to do to these women who don't know what I'm even going to do to them. But then later on, as the years went on, he was sort of looking back at the Cinema Transgression, maybe with somewhat a different viewpoint. He started making films that sort of parodied that. He made a film later on, probably in the early 90s, called My Nightmare. And his nightmare there was that a girl comes into the session to do a shoot with him, a photography, but she won't let him do whatever he wants to her. And she, refuses him and, pushes him aside and says, I don't, get away from me, kind of thing. And that's his nightmare, that he can't do whatever he wants to them. So the thing about that movie is it's kind of neat, is because the first half of that movie, it's a short film, maybe 10 minutes long, is, in his mind, he's doing all these different things to this girl, and she's just willing to go along with it and everything. But then the reality Well, then you realize basically he's just fantasizing all this, and basically you see him lying on a bed jerking off as this is all happening, and then eventually there's a knock at the door, and then you're in the real scenario. The girl's now there at the door for the session, and she doesn't want anything to do with any of this stuff. He's making moves on her, she's slapping his hand away, that kind of thing, and so he's just rejected by the end of it, But I guess prior to her arrival, he's thinking all these things that are going to happen, and this is the way it's going to play out, and of course it doesn't play out that way. So that just kind of shows the difference of even in 5 years, where before that, when he was a junkie or just sort of cleaning himself up from being a junkie, he still had these issues of power and control. He wanted to do what he wanted to these people, and they better be willing to let it happen. Mm-hmm. But 5 years later, he was kind of like, all this was my fantasy. These people probably didn't want any of this stuff to happen, and probably were hoping that I wouldn't be pulling these kind of moves. And so then he made a film basically of exactly that, saying that this is the reality. These people don't want to be groped by me. That this is not a fantasy for them. It's only a fantasy for me. So. And maybe that's also partly just with aging, too. He looked at it as I want these young girls to come, and I want to be able to do what I want to them. Mm-hmm. It's and the reality was that wasn't going to happen. And this was the early 90s, and, political correctness was beginning to build, more so than it was in the 80s, obviously, even. I guess that probably peaked by the mid-90s, mm-hmm. when you had... that's when you even had some sort of backlashes with people like Camille Paglia, doing her writings at that time and everything too. That was probably the early mid-90s.
Would you say that's a backlash?
Well, Camille Paglia she basically had a lot of things to say about a lot of things, right? Yeah. And I think she thought that people were getting soft, especially in American college campuses and universities and things of that people were not. They didn't want to have any responsibility for their own actions. They wanted to blame everybody else for things that happened to them. And she was like, that's not the way it works in life. Mm. So, I don't know what someone like Camille Paglia would have thought of the cinema Transgression. She might have thought it was horrifying as well. But at the same time, she'd probably say, hey, if Lydia Lunch wants to put herself in these scenarios, good for her. That's her right and her choice to do that. Whereas, some feminists would have said that's horrible. She's a victim. She must have been abused by her dad and things like that, right. Which I think she kind of was, actually. I think she's written about that. I don't know if in the case of Lydia Lunch it was sexual abuse, but it was definitely mental abuse. And verbal abuse, because she ran away from home, I think, at 16. Yeah, right? Very young, upstate New York to go to New York City, because her dad was a piece of shit, apparently. So in that case, for someone to say that about Lydia, they're right, I guess, to a certain degree. That probably is her background. There's a certain amount of trauma there. Maybe that's how she dealt with it, Mm-hmm. But then again, also maybe Lydia is just a very outgoing personality, too. Yeah, and maybe wants to live out a lot of her fantasies, and maybe her fantasies a lot of times were dark, I think if you want to live out fantasies that are dark, but you want to do it and you're instigating it, then what's really the problem? Maybe if you get it out of your system by doing it too, then you'll have exercised it and you won't need it anymore.
Yeah, you're working things out psychologically.
Yeah, maybe that's the case. I think her whole life has been sort of working things out, maybe even just anger issues and everything too, because obviously her spoken word is not... It's not pleasant. It's not light comedy. There's a lot of anger and darkness and misery and everything to her. Probably just mainly anger, though, really, I think. Lydia's thing's mainly anger.
Yeah, I remember...
disgust with everything.
I remember watching an interview with her and talking about, they were talking about, alternative music and things. And I remember she turned to whoever it was that was interviewing her, I can't remember who, and said, basically she turned to the camera and said, you want to be alternative? Mm-hmm. Don't play a fucking guitar. Don't play drums. Pick up a tuba. Do something different, for God's sakes.
Yeah. Well, she was just here in town last week doing a show for Canadian Music Week.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a review in the Now, and the review pointed out something about how somebody in the crowd yelled out to her, Lydia, you're a legend. And she's like, oh, darling, only in your mind, not in mine. I'm still alive. I was like, so that's something, that's prime Lydia Lunch kind of thing. It's like, she just does what she does. I don't think she thinks she's a legend, Right. Because she probably knows deep inside, if I'm a legend, how many people am I a legend to? Mm-hmm. The general public, especially now people of a certain age, especially younger people, don't have a fucking clue who she is.
The incomparable Lydia Lunch is definitely somebody that you should all look into. She had a very varied and interesting career, and yeah. Anyway, we're gonna leave part 1 of the Cinema of Transgression with Lewis and Glen there, because and sorry for the abrupt ending, part 1, but we really did believe we could cram all of this into one episode. But of course, being the long-winded folks that we are, we just couldn't. So, we hope that you have enjoyed listening to part 1 of our delving into the Cinema of Transgression, and hope that you will follow it up next week and listen to part 2 of the Cinema of Transgression. We'll leave it now, and we will sign off with an excerpt from the very able and interesting Miss Lynch. See you next week.
Hello? Is this my mommy? I want to speak to my mommy. You know who she is. Put her on, okay? Mommy? Mommy, is that you?
I can only put Mommy on, Joey, after you've given me the credit card number and the expiration date. You know it takes money to talk to Mommy. She taught you that, didn't she? Now go ahead, Joey. Give me the number.
What number, Mommy?
The fucking credit card number.
Thank you for listening. Music is played by Trigger Warning. Check out their Facebook page. Links are in the show notes. A Very Suspect podcast is copyright suspect video. All rights reserved. See you next week.
Into your words, I wonder why